For decades, Pattie Boyd was remembered as the beautiful woman standing beside two of rock music's most famous guitarists. She was the model who became George Harrison's wife, the woman who inspired Eric Clapton's obsession, and, in the eyes of millions of fans, the woman at the center of one of the greatest love triangles in rock history. But that version of the story leaves something out. Because behind the photographs, the famous songs, the glamorous houses, and the legendary parties was a much darker reality. Pattie eventually had to confront addiction, betrayal, emotional pain, and behavior from the man she married that she later admitted had deeply damaged their relationship. And when you look back at what happened, some of the most famous love songs in rock history begin to sound very different. This is not simply a story about George Harrison and Eric Clapton. It is the story of Pattie Boyd finally stepping out from behind their shadows. And to understand why her story became so painful, we have to go back to the beginning. The girl who never had one home. Patricia Boyd was born in Somerset, England, in 1944. Long before she became one of the most recognizable faces of the 1960s, Pattie was simply a young girl growing up in a family that never seemed to stay in one place for very long. Her childhood took her between England, Scotland, and Kenya. When she was only 8 years old, her parents sent her to boarding school near Nairobi. Imagine being that young and suddenly being separated from your family. Then, during one of her school breaks, Pattie came home and discovered that her parents had divorced. For a child who was already learning how to live far away from home, it was another major emotional shock. Eventually, Pattie returned to England with her mother, stepfather, and younger half-brothers. She attended several schools before finishing her education in 1961. Then, at just 17 years old, Pattie made a decision that would completely change her life. She moved to London, and she arrived at exactly the right moment. London was exploding with fashion, music, youth culture, and a new kind of freedom. The old rules were disappearing, and Pattie quickly discovered that she had something the fashion industry wanted: a distinctive face, a striking look, and an innocence that perfectly matched the changing culture. By 1962, she was working as a model. Soon, she was traveling between London and Paris and appearing in major magazines. She was becoming one of the faces of the new British fashion movement. But Pattie had no idea that modeling would eventually put her directly in the path of one of the biggest bands in history. One line that changed everything. In 1964, Pattie appeared in a television commercial for Smith's Crisps. That commercial caught the attention of director Richard Lester. Lester was working on the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night. He cast Pattie in the movie. Her role was tiny. She had only one line. But sometimes one small opportunity is enough to completely change someone's life. Because while Pattie was standing on that film set, George Harrison noticed her. George was already one of the most famous men on the planet. But his interest in Pattie quickly became personal. Not long after filming, Pattie ended her relationship with her boyfriend and accepted George's invitation to go out. Their first date was unusually formal. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, even chaperoned them at the Garrick Club. But after that first night, everything moved quickly. Pattie and George became a couple. And suddenly, Pattie was no longer simply a successful young model. She was a Beatles girlfriend. The attention was overwhelming. Where George went, cameras followed. Where Pattie went, reporters wanted to know about George. Eventually, George bought a secluded house called Kinfons, hoping the couple could escape the constant attention. For a while, it worked. But their private life was about to become far more complicated. The marriage everyone wanted to believe in. On Christmas Day in 1965, George proposed. He wanted Brian Epstein's blessing before he officially asked Pattie. And when everything was settled, Pattie said yes. They married on January 21, 1966. It was surprisingly simple. No giant celebrity wedding. No enormous public spectacle. Just a quiet registry office ceremony. For Pattie, it was actually a little disappointing. She had imagined something more traditional. A church. A beautiful ceremony. A wedding that felt like the beginning of a fairy tale. Instead, she became Mrs. George Harrison in a small ceremony designed partly to keep the press away. Still, from the outside, they looked perfect. George was a Beatle. Patty was one of Britain's most fashionable young models. They had fame, money, beauty, and a world of possibilities ahead of them. But Patty was becoming much more than a famous rock star's wife. She influenced George in ways that would eventually reach far beyond their marriage. She introduced him to new experiences. She became interested in spirituality. She encouraged him to explore transcendental meditation. And in 1968, she traveled with George to India as the Beatles became deeply involved with Eastern spirituality. Patty even documented parts of that journey with her camera. She was watching history happen from inside the room. But while the public saw romance, something underneath the surface was beginning to change. And then another man entered the story. Eric Clapton, the friend who fell in love with his best friend's wife. Eric Clapton and George Harrison were close friends. They were musicians. They shared the same world. They played together. They admired each other's work. But Clapton developed feelings for Patty. And these were not casual feelings. They became an obsession. At one point, Clapton even dated Patty's sister Paula. It sounds unbelievable. But Patty later believed that relationship badly damaged her sister's confidence. Then came the letters. One day in 1970, Patty received an unusual letter. The writer wanted to know whether she still loved her husband. The message was strange enough to make Patty wonder who could possibly have written it. Then the phone rang. It was Eric Clapton. Suddenly, everything made sense. The anonymous admirer was Clapton, and he was no longer hiding what he wanted. He wrote Patty another letter. He poured his feelings into music. And eventually, he created one of the most famous songs in rock history. Layla. Clapton played the recording for Patty privately. She was overwhelmed. But she wasn't simply flattered. She was embarrassed. She knew people would recognize what the song was about. And suddenly, the romantic story that fans later celebrated looked much more complicated. Because Patty was not a character in a love song. She was a real person caught between two powerful men. And the situation became even more disturbing. At a party hosted by music executive Robert Stigwood, George reportedly found Patty sitting with Clapton. Clapton was expressing his feelings. George was furious. The triangle was no longer a secret. For the moment, Patty chose George. But Clapton refused to let go. And this is where the story stopped looking like a glamorous rock and roll romance. When love turned into something darker, Clapton's heartbreak became increasingly destructive. The source account describes him showing up at the Harrison home with drugs and threatening to take the entire supply if Patty would not leave with him. That is not the image of romantic devotion that later surrounded the story. It is frightening. It is controlling. And it shows how badly addiction and obsession had begun to affect Clapton's behavior. Eventually, his drug use became severe. He withdrew from friends. He isolated himself. And the man who had once been one of the brightest stars in music was disappearing inside his addiction. But Patty's own marriage was also falling apart. George's spiritual life was taking him in another direction. Their hopes of building a family had not worked out. Both became involved with other people. And then came the discovery that finally shattered what remained of Patty's marriage. George had become involved with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. When Patty discovered them together at Friar Park, something inside her finally broke. She went upstairs. She tore down George's sacred OM flag and replaced it with a skull and crossbones flag. It was almost like a final declaration. The marriage was finished. On July 4, 1974, Patty left George Harrison. The woman who had once been one of the most famous wives in rock music was suddenly alone. But the story still wasn't over. Patty chooses Eric. After leaving George, Patty finally chose Eric Clapton. The two were married on March 27, 1979. And George Harrison was actually there. Instead of turning the wedding into a bitter confrontation, George joked about the strange situation and reportedly referred to Clapton as his husband-in-law. It was an astonishingly peaceful ending to one of rock's most complicated triangles. But the wedding did not magically fix everything. Because once Patty and Eric were finally together, the fantasy began colliding with reality. Patty later questioned whether Clapton had truly been in love with her, or whether part of his obsession came from the fact that she was George Harrison's wife. That question is important, because sometimes people spend years chasing something they believe will make them happy. And then, when they finally get it, they discover the real problem was never the person they wanted. It was something inside themselves. Clapton struggled with addiction. Patty struggled emotionally, and their glamorous marriage became increasingly unstable. Patty began drinking heavily. Clapton later acknowledged that his addiction affected the marriage and that he had mistreated Patty during that period. This is the part that changes the story. The woman who had once been described as a rock and roll muse was now living inside the consequences of the lifestyle that fans had romanticized for years. The parties, the drugs, the fame, the obsession, the betrayal. None of it looked glamorous anymore. And Patty was paying the price. The pain nobody could fix. There was another heartbreak waiting. Patty and Eric desperately wanted children. They tried IVF. In 1984, then again in 1987. Both attempts ended in miscarriage. For Patty, the losses were devastating. She had imagined motherhood as part of her future. But suddenly, the future she had pictured was disappearing. And while Patty was dealing with that pain, Eric was having an affair with Italian actress Lori Del Santo. The relationship became much more serious when Del Santo became pregnant. In 1986, she gave birth to Eric's son. For Patty, it was another devastating betrayal. She had already endured addiction. She had endured emotional instability. She had endured the miscarriages. And now her husband was building another life outside their marriage. There was simply nothing left. In April 1987, Patty walked away. Their divorce was completed in 1989. And after nearly 2 decades tied to two of rock music's most famous men, Patty Boyd was finally free. But freedom created another problem. Who was Patty Boyd without George Harrison? Who was Patty Boyd without Eric Clapton? For years, the world had defined her through the men beside her. Now she had to define herself. The woman behind the muse. At one point, Patty reportedly admitted that she felt almost lost. She had spent so much of her adult life being known as somebody's wife. George's wife. Eric's wife. The muse. The woman who inspired songs. But what about Patty? Who was she? That question eventually became the beginning of her strongest chapter. In 1991, Patty co-founded a self-help addiction recovery program called Sharp with Barbara Bach, Ringo Starr's wife. After spending years watching addiction destroy relationships, Patty wanted to help people facing similar struggles. She also returned to something she had quietly loved for years: photography. Patty had photographed the people around her during some of the most important moments in rock history. The Beatles, George, Eric, friends, private moments, life behind the scenes. She wasn't necessarily thinking about fame. She was simply capturing moments. Years later, those photographs became an exhibition called Through the Eye of a Muse. And suddenly, people weren't looking at Patty as somebody's wife. They were looking through Patty's eyes. That distinction matters, because for decades the world had looked at her. Now Patty was the one showing the world what she had seen. Patty finally tells her side. In 2007, Patty published her autobiography. And that book gave her something she had rarely had before: control over her own story. For years, the public had heard George's music. They had heard Clapton's songs. They had seen the photographs. They knew the legend. But Patty knew what life inside that legend actually felt like. Her autobiography reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And suddenly, the woman who had been treated like a supporting character in two men's stories became the narrator. That was perhaps the most important transformation of all. Because Patty wasn't saying that her life had been perfect. It wasn't. There had been betrayal. There had been addiction. There had been heartbreak. There had been failed attempts to build a family. There had been moments when people she loved behaved in ways that deeply hurt her. But Patty survived all of it. And eventually, she found a way to tell the story without allowing the story to define her. The ending nobody expected. Perhaps one of the most emotional chapters came years after Patty and George had divorced. George visited Patty shortly before his death in 2001. They spent time together. They drank tea. They listened to music. And for a moment, the complicated past seemed to disappear. There was no rock and roll triangle. No failed marriage. No public scandal. Just two people who had once loved each other. George eventually died in November 2001. And Patty was left with memories that could never be recreated. But she continued moving forward. In 2015, after 24 years together, Patty married property developer Rod Weston. The ceremony was simple. Almost fittingly, it took place at a registry office. After everything Patty had experienced, perhaps she no longer needed a grand ceremony to prove that something was real. She had already learned that beautiful weddings don't guarantee beautiful marriages. Famous songs don't guarantee happy relationships. And being desired by millions of people doesn't mean you feel valued by the person closest to you. That may be the real lesson of Patty Boyd's story. The truth behind the legend. For decades, fans looked at Patty Boyd and saw a muse. The woman behind something. The woman behind Layla. The beautiful model who inspired two legendary musicians. But Patty's real story is much bigger. She was a child who experienced family separation. A young woman who found fame unexpectedly. A model who entered the Beatles' world. A wife who watched her marriage collapse. A woman caught in an extraordinary love triangle. A survivor of addiction's consequences. A woman who experienced devastating miscarriages. And eventually, a person who had to rebuild her identity from scratch. That is why the darker parts of her story matter. Not because they make the gossip more shocking, but because they reveal what the glamorous photographs never could. Behind every famous love story are real people. Behind every legendary song is sometimes a painful memory. And behind every muse is a human being with her own version of what happened. Patty Boyd spent decades being described through the eyes of George Harrison and Eric Clapton. Eventually, she stopped accepting that. She picked up her camera. She wrote her story. She built a new life. And most importantly, she became Patty Boyd again. Not George Harrison's wife. Not Eric Clapton's muse. Not the woman trapped inside a rock and roll love triangle. Just Patty. And perhaps that is the part of her story that deserves to be remembered most.